How do religious claims over urban territory influence the dynamics of conflict? Is settler colonialism in Jerusalem any different from that in the Jordan Valley or French Algeria? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for today's episode on the politics of holy cities, we're delighted to be speaking with Mick and Maha Samman. Mick is Professor of Middle East Politics at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. The author of several books on Jerusalem, his most recent publication is a wide-ranging Power, Piety, and People, the Politics of Holy Cities in the 21st Century. Maha Samman is an architect, urban planner, and assistant professor at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. She is the author of Transcolonial Urban Space in Palestine, Politics and Development, as well as various articles on urban politics, colonial space, and everyday life in Jerusalem. Mick and Maha Samman, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this episode of Connections. Mick, if I could start with a question for you. Most of your research has been on Palestine and specifically on Jerusalem. In your latest book, you also went further afield, looking at the role of exclusivist religious and ethno-nationalist claims on urban space in, for example, India and Northern Ireland. Why have you termed these places holy cities, and what particular characteristics set their conflicts apart from others?
Well, I've identified a number of cities which have a lot of holy sites, powerful religious clergy, financial revenue flows which are based around religious activities, and then activities in the city itself which provide a platform for religious ritual. And not every city has this. You have capital cities, you have port cities, you have mining cities, university cities. But cities with a lot of religious associations, I believe, have a new set of or a different set of problems, which need to be examined as a result of their religiosity in the city. It doesn't mean that they don't have other problems or issues to do with the urban settlements. Those are there as well. But it's like putting on a different pair of glasses that you sort of see through the lenses. You understand how the religious dynamics often drive some of the conflicts in those cities.
Maha, if we look specifically at Jerusalem, do these dynamics resonate with you, or are there perhaps also other and different ones which you feel deserve emphasis?
Yeah, thank you for hosting me today, this evening, Mouin, and I'm glad to be with Mick today. Let me build on what Mick just said. And if I think about holy cities, the first question that comes to mind is what is a city first, before relating it to other definitions like what Mick mentioned, port cities or university cities. The definition, there is no consensus about a definition of a city. And if we combine it with other terms, then it becomes more complicated. So if we think about what a city is, and going back to the 1930s, for example, works of Louis Mumford or Louis Wirth, for example, they criticized previous definitions of a city and try to come up with new ideas incorporating social aspects. Now, more scholars came out with new definitions later on and criticized the previous ones. Now, for me, I think one of the scholars who are important and give important contribution to definition of cities is Spiro Kostov. In his book, The City Shaped, he's an urban and architectural historian who had a long-term broad work on cities. And he came out with 9 characteristic of cities. None of them is related to religion or holiness, and I'm not going to go into the 9 characteristics, but for example, I would give 1 or 2 examples. For example, one aspect is the energized crowding, meaning that he focused on ideas of density rather than size or number of population. Or, for example, he talked about circumscription, which was previously walls surrounding a city, but later became a kind of official boundaries. Now, in relation to Jerusalem, from the 9 characteristics that I think are important are 2 aspects. One is related to the monumental framework, and the other is related to urban resources. And by monumental frameworks, obviously, when we look at the city of Jerusalem, the religious sites, whether it is for Jews, Muslims, or for Christians, also contribute from an architectural point of view to monuments. Because monuments are important in cities, according to Spiro Kostov. These 9 characteristics are important to identify city as city. And when we look at these religious sites, if a city does not have such monuments, then it goes on to what we call placelessness, meaning that there is no kind of identity that differentiates between one city and another. Now, coming back to Jerusalem, and with the idea of from an architectural point of view, for example, the Haram al-Sharif and the Dome of the Rock with the golden dome dominating the skyline of the city, it's very important, not only architecturally, but also how it has built a relationship with the people living in it. Meaning, if you ask a child to draw a drawing about Jerusalem, he or she would quickly draw the Dome of the Rock, or you would find it on book covers, or even the 20 dinars bill of Jordanian money. So this is one thing. The other thing is the urban resource. And by urban resource, I would think that this is related to the faith, meaning that the religious faith is important as a resource, because while the importance of Jerusalem as or the holy sites as monuments for the local people, when we talk about it as an urban resource, we talk about faith, which is not only important in the local scale, but also on a regional and international scale. Meaning that if something happens within these holy sites, they would affect or have consequences regionally and internationally. And coming back to the issue of holy cities, I think it's important and very useful to think about other cases and try to unpack different elements, and that would help identify things in Jerusalem. But I still think that maybe Jerusalem has some kind of uniqueness that makes it very challenging to compare it or put it within a comparative framework.
Thank you. But let's take that a bit further, and perhaps to repeat the question I posed to introduce this episode, which is if we look at Jerusalem and compare it to the Jordan Valley or French Algeria, what sets it apart? Maha, you're speaking to us from Jerusalem, and you've done extensive research in Palestine. So, what are the dynamics specific to Jerusalem that we, for example, would not observe elsewhere in the occupied territories, and that have to do with this broader theme that Mick addresses in his book about holy cities, if you do see any?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think that the significance of the holiness about Jerusalem is that it has significance on a regional and international level, rather than only a local level. But when looking on other cases, they may not have this kind of significance, because for Muslims, for example, who comprise around 25% of the world population, or for the Holy Sepulchre, which is important also for Christians, who comprise around 33% of the globe population. So this importance goes beyond the local aspects. Now, another aspect which is different than other cases is that we are talking now about a case which is ongoing in real time, while other cases are now in a situation which are post-colonial or neo-colonial. So if we want to kind of extract lessons learned, we have to look, identify abstract theories or methodologies on how to try to benefit from previous cases and reflect them on an ongoing case.
Right. Mick, do you see it the same way?
Well, I think Maha made a very good point when she emphasized the international aspects that makes religious cities or holy cities have an impact beyond their immediate frontiers or their immediate borders. And Jerusalem's clearly, is very central to a lot of the discussions in about the future of the region and the balance of power between the different actors in the region. But I would also say that beyond that, there are specific activities associated with the religiosity in the city, which do create problems which will make it different from the Jordan Valley or from certain parts of French Algeria. And simply land ownership. Much of the property is owned by religious foundations, and so you immediately get kind of an inherent segregation in terms of residency. People not driven into ghettos or into enclaves, but because of the land ownership between and the way that the land is controlled by different religious groups, which may have the backing of the state or not the backing of the state. And in Jerusalem, clearly the Jewish community would have the backing of the state. This sets up a kind of religious prism to the territorial divisions within the city. Another issue would be that some religious sites are not in the heart of the communities where they're situated. They're adjacent to, or perhaps even in a community within the territorial area of another community. And so visitations, processions, public displays of devotion impinge on the life of another community. And this can cause tensions if it's on the if there's congestion, or if there's it falls on a day that might be holy to the other community. There's misunderstandings about it. There's pressure to sort of enhance or strengthen that access to these religious sites, which then cause even more tension. So there's all the practical living arrangements are quite unique to religious cities with religious associations. You wouldn't get that the same, say, in Boston in the United States as you would in Jerusalem. You wouldn't get that kind of same tension.
Yet you included Belfast in your case studies, and I was curious, given what both you and Maha have said about religious monuments and land ownership and so on, how that, for example, fits in with the other cases you've looked at.
Actually, Mouin, I have to correct you there. I consider Belfast and discuss it, but I don't actually make it one of my case studies.
Okay, corrected.
But I use this as an example how religion plays a very major role, but it doesn't have a central position in either Catholicism or in Protestantism that makes it a city that has reverberations or meaning much beyond Belfast or Northern Ireland. Those religious tensions, if there's tensions in Belfast, people from Indonesia or from Buenos Aires are not particularly bothered about it. But if there's tensions in Jerusalem, people from different parts of the world are very bothered about it, and I think that's the reason I dropped Belfast, but I did consider it as a possibility.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. And turning to Maha now, in your own research, you've often returned to the themes of time and space and the interaction between them. Could you elaborate a bit on these concepts and specifically how, in your view, they apply to Jerusalem?
Yes, well, I will build on what Mick was talking about and your previous question as well. I see the Zionist case as an advanced settler colonial case. So when I started working on how to understand the conflict or where to situate the conflict, I went and I looked at literature related to previous colonial cases. So, in looking at these cases, for example, French Algiers or British Sri Lanka, and many other cases, as I said at the beginning, that they are previous cases, meaning that the literature is written on them at a time when the colony is already done. And now it's with the Zionist case, it is an ongoing situation. So, in order to identify a kind of a framework to work and understand these previous cases and to relate them to an existing situation, I had to go to something abstract. And therefore, I used the concept of space, and specifically, I depended on the work of Henry Lefebvre on the production of space. And in his book, The Production of Space, he identifies three aspects of space, which are perceived space, conceived space, and lived space. And I tried to reflect these on the production of colonial space, meaning I tried to look at the previous cases and the Zionist case, and came out with some variables which are important to understand the Zionist case in specific. For example, my own interpretation of the perceived space is related more to philosophical ideas, policy-oriented ideas, and they are the space of the policymakers. Yes. When looking at the conceived space, it's more about how the geography is altered, how it is changed. So it is more about the planners, the professionals who work on this level of space, and therefore the impact of this would affect the actual space on ground. So, and the third part is the lived space, which is related to the local people, the people who are living on ground, the usual people. So, and in the analysis, I tried to extract from the non-temporal and the temporal aspect to try to identify some variables. And these variables related to these perceived conceived spaces are, for example, the perceived space, we're talking about power, knowledge, technology, and under the conceived space, we're talking about strategic planning, spatial planning. And under the lived space, we talk about things that affect the daily life of the people, such as demography, economical aspects, cultural aspects. So this framework of providing these variables helped me to identify a methodology to understand different colonial cases, and help me to analyze the Zionist case in detail. So, meaning that if we try to analyze the colonizer and the colonized, one would end up having different ideas on what are the strength and the weaknesses of each party. And then if we want to build a kind of policy and strategy for Palestinians on how to reconfigure the modes of power, one has to work on many different levels. And here I suggest the concept of transcolonialism, which transcends the time and the space, meaning it could be worked on in different spaces, and it could work whether you are still under colonialism or in a neo-colonial stage or in a post-colonial stage.
Thank you. And picking slightly off of the points you've just made, and if I could turn to Mick, when people discuss these issues, and I think both you and Maha have done this in your own writings, when talking about Jerusalem, we tend very much to focus on Israel and the Palestinians. Israel's colonial encroachment and the dispossession of the Palestinians. And when religion comes into this, people tend to think of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Muslims as kind of the two main competing groups. Yet I think what makes Jerusalem unique is the extent to which it's been affected by a religious group that doesn't even reside in this city. And here I'm thinking specifically of American evangelicals and the impact that they have had on the way that things have developed in Jerusalem. And we saw this, I think, very clearly, for example, during the Trump years. And I was curious, Mick, if in the other case studies that you discuss in your book, kind of non-resident groups also had a significant impact on developments in particular cities, the way they seem to have in Jerusalem.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, Mouin. The international aspect of Jerusalem is partly illustrated by the role of American evangelicals and the influence that they have on U.S. policy. There is, in the examples I examined, there is much less of that international diaspora or satellite communities having an influence. My examples included Cordoba in southern Spain and Benares in India and Lhasa in Tibet, and then Georgetown in Malaysia. And in all of those, there are diasporic connections which are quite powerful, but they don't have an impact on the policy of great powers and their influence in the decisions about the future of a particular city. So in Benares, for example, 1/3 of the population is Muslim and 2/3 is Hindu, and the Hindu nationalists are taking a very aggressive view of the properties that belong to the Muslim community and trying to rehabilitate them or what they regard is to restore them back to their original Hindu owners. And this is being fed and supported by the national government. And there is a little bit of a sort of support for the Muslim community from Pakistan and from the Gulf states and some of the Salafi groups, but it's not particularly strong because Benares for the Muslim community isn't that iconic city. It may be iconic for the Hindus, but Benares doesn't have these great Muslim universities or seminaries or a big tradition of clergy power. It's not a great center for international Muslim pilgrimage. So that international element is not there. Well, you can easily contrast that with Jerusalem, where the Christian calendar sucks in Christian support from all around the world, not just the evangelicals, but also the Roman Catholic world as well. So Jerusalem is unique in this respect. There are other cities that may have aspects of this internationalization, but not to the degree that Jerusalem has, by any means.
And if I could bring another example from your recent book, Georgetown in Malaysia, which I think, if I understood you correctly, it's kind of given as a case study where sectarian differences or religious differences, or however you want to term them, don't necessarily translate into political conflict, and that therefore perhaps we should revisit this automatic assumption that religious difference necessarily produces political conflict.
Well, it was exactly why I was attracted to examine Georgetown, because it was a puzzle to me that it had, at least 22 different religious groupings. There's some festival every week, with roads being shut and changes to the calendar of the city, and I couldn't understand why, with so many potential points of friction, with religious sites very close to each other, and all these different activities around the religious sites taking place, I couldn't understand why there wouldn't be more problems. And it goes back to a point I make again. Many of these sites are probably peripheral to the main religions. They're not unimportant to the people living there. They're very important, but to the wider community, they're not central. So Georgetown is an important place for pilgrims going to Mecca.
You mean those who don't live there?
Pardon?
You mean not important to adherents of a particular religion who don't reside there?
Yeah. So Georgetown has one of the largest sleeping Buddha statues in the Southeast Asia. So it's quite important, but it doesn't compete with other Buddhist sites in India or in Thailand. It's just not of the same centrality to the religious faith. So I think that's quite important. They're fairly peripheral sites, and the clergy are fairly new. The city's about 150 years old. It hasn't got those deep roots. But another very important point is that while Georgetown is in a Malaysian federal system, and the federal system privileges Muslim Malay faith over all the other faiths, and so there is there's Islamic push in the constitution which can be discriminatory. The actual city itself is predominantly Buddhist and predominantly Chinese, and there's a pushback against the national level by the city level. So many of the federal laws which would have applied to Georgetown are kind of neutralized by this strong city identity. And that's another interesting factor. We might have the internationalization of a city, but also strong local identities can also mitigate some of the kind of ethno-nationalist, exclusivist ideologies which are imposed on cities.
Right. Maha, your own work is focused, I think, very much on colonialism, rather than looking at the impact of religion on this conflict in any specific way. Would it be your argument that religion and religious polarization is essentially an at best secondary factor in trying to understand what has been happening in Jerusalem and in Palestine more broadly, and that we should see this first and foremost in kind of classic, as within a classic settler colonialist paradigm, and not pay too much attention to these other types of differences?
I think that religion is very important in the case of Palestine, because it is important to distinguish between the Judaism as a faith and Zionism use of different interpretation of religion for colonial and settler practices. So in this sense, this becomes integral in how the city is planned and replanned and reproduced in terms of trying to reflect on spatial issues, relating them to texts in the holy books. So in this sense, the way religion is used comes within the settler colonial paradigm, and that's why the way that the city is planned now, with all these segregations and the checkpoints and the separation wall, is integral in how the religion is used. Now, the impact is very much related to how we look at other settler colonial cases, but of course, I think that religion is an integral part on how this has developed.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps a question for both of you. I mean, what I find interesting, if you look at the case of Jerusalem, is that religious claims are being used perhaps less to promote a privileged position for one religious community versus the other, although that's part of it, but is being primarily used as a vehicle to advance and consolidate claims of political sovereignty. And Mick, perhaps if I start with you, does that set Jerusalem apart from other cases you've examined? In these other cases, is it mainly about one community seeking to derive advantages over another, or does the state also play such a powerful role in using these religious issues to advance its own agendas of exclusive sovereignty and so on?
I don't think Jerusalem's unique in that. It's much more complicated because of the number of sites and how close they are together, and the fact that there's it's not a binary. It's not a Muslim versus Jewish issue. It's Muslim versus Jewish plus Christian as well. So there's a third element in there. And as we've mentioned, there's also then the level of the international dimensions to that. In the other cities I've examined, for example, in Cordoba, and that was more of a historical examination. Although for those of you who are not familiar with it, Cordoba, the issue there is there's a very large mosque, beautiful mosque, that was taken over by a Christian conquest and in the 14th, 15th century, and then a big cathedral was implanted in the middle of the mosque. And it's a very bizarre setup, but it was, and it's been there now for several hundred years, but it still clearly is a mosque when you visit it. And so there's a tendency for tourists to want to pray there, particularly to
Muslim tourists.
Pardon?
Muslim
tourists. Yeah, from North Africa, because it's so clearly a mosque, even though there's a cathedral right in the middle of it, and this causes lots of tensions, and so there is a sense. Now, if in Cordoba there'd been a large and vibrant Muslim community, they would have problems. But as it is, it's a very small and very impoverished Muslim community in Cordoba. So there's no kind of ground-swelling support for any revival of Muslim prayer in this site. Much of that that movement is coming from outside. But there is very similar situation in Benares in India, where the Hindus are wanting to take over a particular mosque which they claim was built on the site of a Hindu temple, and they're pushing hard for the government to intervene to reverse the ownership. In Lhasa, it's actually quite interesting. Rather than the Chinese Communist Party having occupied Lhasa, rather than wanting to replace the Buddhist monuments and introduce, claim back. They're not claim back a site. They're not attempting to do that at all. They're not trying to claim back a pre-existing Han Chinese property. They are trying to break the power of the Buddhist clergy. And so the control of the sites is not to do with the Han Chinese having had previous associations with these sites or previous claims. It's entirely to do with a power struggle between the Communist Party and the Buddhist hierarchy, which still claim the allegiance of 99% of the Tibetan people.
Right. Thank you. Maha, I'd like to get back again to this issue you've raised of the interaction between space and time, and perhaps if we now look forward at what we can expect in the coming period in Jerusalem, where you've had, I think, this highly intensified Israeli campaign, for example, with the construction of the wall, with the withdrawal of residency permits, and so on. How do you see this playing out in the coming years, and what do you think will be the main dynamics that influence the development of events?
Well, what I see is going on now is more, impinging more. Whether it's a colonial spatial interventions on space that affect the everyday life of the people, not only in terms of space but also in terms of time. So if I want to reflect on the issue of time, I see that even it's a kind of colonizing the time of the Palestinians, in the sense that everything that is happening takes more time, and people become even losing their own time every single day. And that's what I wrote about, an article named From Moments to Duration, meaning that when a Palestinian want to move from one place to another, which should take few minutes, it takes sometimes hours, meaning every moment has its own experience, and then it's enlarged to wider experiences that have negative impact on the Palestinians.
Because of obstacles and checkpoints and so on.
Yes, for example, if we look at the Qalandia checkpoint and we want to move from Kufr Aqab, which is an area within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, but outside the separation wall, and there's the Qalandia checkpoint in between, then there's a whole experience of how to move from one place to another that in a usual time shouldn't take few minutes, but with the existence of these segregation elements of control and domination, then it takes much more time. And within each moment, there is a new experience, negative experience, that the Palestinians need to try to find ways to overcome them in terms of producing ways of resilience. Yes, so this is ongoing, and it seems to even continue in the near future. The more, but I would like to say that the more such things are infringed on the Palestinian, the more the Palestinians would look for more ways to find their way to enter Jerusalem, and to find their ways to take part in the city as a Palestinian city as well.
Because I think if my statistical memory is correct, the construction of the separation wall, in fact, led to a huge influx of Palestinians who had been living outside it back to the city in order not to lose their residency rights in Jerusalem. As we near the conclusion of our discussion, I'd like to ask Mick if he perhaps has any concluding thoughts. I think it's fair to say that in the 21st century, religion has been seen as an increasingly prominent driver of conflict. Many people would say that's really misinterpreting what is driving many of these conflicts. And given that you've looked at this issue on several continents, I was wondering if you had any concluding thoughts in this respect.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main findings of my research is that and this goes back to a point that Maha made at the beginning about the different characteristics of a city. And I don't know to what extent this is shared amongst most urban scholars, but I think one of the key characteristics of a city is heterodoxy, it's heterogeneity. It's it's very unlikely that you've got a monoculture. You know, a city thrives through interactions of different cultures and different ethnicities and different religions and faiths and employment practices, etc. And there's an inherent contradiction in ethno-nationalist ideologies and their application to cities. If you're trying to impose an ideology which privileges one community over the others, by excluding them from resources, by suppressing their representation, those other communities will go look for support elsewhere, financial support, political support, mobilization, solidarities outside. I mean, that's clearly what happened in Belfast with the support the Catholic community looking south. It's clearly happening in Benares and in Tibet, and in Jerusalem. It's very clear that as the Zionist ideologies imposed on the city, Palestinians are gaining support from other sources, and it's almost this the imposition of this ideology is creating the resistance to it at the same time. So there's kind of an inherent contradiction, and I call this in my book as the paradox of nationalist urban governance. There's something inherently, it sets up the imposition sets up a resistance, and so on one hand I'm very pessimistic about what's happening in Jerusalem now, and very pessimistic about an outcome which will satisfy Palestinian aspirations in terms of the balance of power internationally. I'm quite optimistic in the sense that the monumental stuff that Maha talked about grounds the Palestinian community so deeply in the city that their exclusion from it is a very uphill task for the Israelis. And their attempt to impose this Zionist ideology is coming up against quite deep foundations. You know, it's not going to be easy for them to try and achieve this kind of dominance, which is what they apparently have been trying to do.
Thank you. And I once again like to thank both of you, Mick and Maha Samman, for this very interesting discussion on the politics of holy cities. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.